morning. He won't fail us. Isn't that great? Someone here that doesn't know who I am this morning, or if you're watching online, my name is Curt Wyse. My wife Dawn and I are members here, but I end up not attending here very often because I'm preaching at other places. And I feel like this morning I'm preaching to a bunch of liars. Because when I came in this morning, I made a point of asking people how they were doing. And I had one person say, "I'm here," like that was a struggle. And all the rest of you that I talked to said you were doing fine. So either I'm the only one that struggles around here, or you guys are all lying. So, and there's this fine line between knowing what to say, right? When someone asks you, because none of us want to be the complainer. I hope. I don't want to be the complainer. But yeah, my wife continually tells me that I need to be a little bit more transparent because she and others don't know how to pray if I'm not telling them what the struggles are. And so, it's been a tough 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, Dawn and I were finally trying to get away to celebrate our 38th anniversary. It's hard for us to get away from the store. And so we had this window between 4 o'clock on Saturday that we could get away, and then we had to be back at work on Tuesday morning. So we had Sunday and Monday. So we decided we wanted to get away. We knew if we stayed at the house, all we would do would be work. And so we went to Des Moines. And then I got a call from my parents, from my dad, saying my mom had fallen. My parents are both 93. They live independently. Mom had fallen, knocked herself unconscious. She was on her way to the hospital while Dad was on the phone, and he was trying to get a ride there because he doesn't drive anymore. And so I'm trying to figure out, so what do I do, right? What do I do? I was looking at our schedule, and I'm like, I really can't pick up and leave, but yet I really need to be there. And I'm supposed to preach this coming Sunday. That was last Sunday. I'm like, I'm supposed to preach. What am I going to do here? And so Dawn and I were discussing it, and I got a text from the pastor of the church I was supposed to preach at, and he goes, "Hey, we're excited about you coming on Sunday, and we also recognize that your wife Dawn has a prophetic gift. If there's something that she would like to say, that she feels like she's supposed to say, we would love to hear it." And so I show her this text, and she looks at me, and she goes, "I was thinking that God might have me fill in for you this week." So I contacted the pastor, and I'm like, "Are you okay with a woman in the pulpit?" I said, "I think you are, but I want to make sure." And he goes, "Absolutely." And I said, "Then can my wife sub for me? I have to go to Florida." And so last week, Dawn filled the pulpit for me. She wouldn't say that she preached. She would say that she shared, that she talked. I take all of my sermons. I've been doing this for a while. I convert them into a low quality podcast. And I did hers too. So if you want to listen to what she had to say, you can go to Google, or to Spotify, or to some of the others. Just search for Curt Wyse sermons. You'll find all of mine. Hers is in there with mine. So we're in Des Moines. I'm trying to figure out, what am I going to do, right? Do I just fly from Des Moines? Do I need to get there right away? So I pulled it up, and it was already too late in the day to catch a flight without spending a night in the airport. And I'm not a big fan of spending a night in an airport. So he said, we'll go back to Kalona, and I'll fly out of here on Tuesday morning. And so I did. And I got down to Florida, and Mom was home. They kept her in the hospital in intensive care overnight, and then sent her home. When she got home, she had fallen 3 more times. She was confused. She didn't know why. My sister and I were both coming. She didn't remember any of her falls. But as the days went on, she seemed to be making a little bit more sense to her. But in the meantime, we discovered that Dad's back was killing him. That when she had fallen, he tried to help her up. Mental note here, as you get age, you can't always do that. He ended up crushing a vertebrae. And so he could barely move. Mom wasn't all the way there as far as knowing what was going on. And it was real obvious to my sister and I that Mom and Dad can't continue living alone. So my sister, she's like, "Well, I'll stay here." She works in a school district, so she's on a school council. She goes, "I can stay here all summer if I need to, but we need to get him into some sort of assisted living." And so The next day, I think it was on Wednesday, we set up an appointment with the administrator of this um, thing they're with. They were in independent living. So we set up a meeting with the administrator and found out they were all first on the list for an assisted living place. We knew that someone was going to be moving out the end of June. We thought that it would take them a month to get the place ready. We were thinking mom and dad will have to wait until August to get into a place. In this meeting, the administrator says, someone just unexpectedly moved out. They haven't been here very long. All this unit needs is to be repainted, and they're repainting it as we speak. He says, you can move in tomorrow if you're ready. And so God was just putting things into place. He says, we need to get a form filled out by hospice, a form filled out by your doctor, and we're good to go. Thursday morning, they called and they said, we have those forms. The movers are going to be at your place at 9 o'clock on Friday. We didn't have anything ready to move. The movers came in. The movers are emptying the dishwasher and packing stuff up. Literally. We sent mom and dad off for breakfast. My sister took them to get them out so that they wouldn't have to be there and see what was happening. And my brother-in-law and I kind of sat there and watched the movers as they just packed everything up. And so that was kind of how my week was going. And then I decided it was time to come home. I had bought a one-way ticket down there because I didn't know how long I'd be there, so I bought a one-way ticket home to come home last Sunday. I got to the airport. It was a late afternoon flight. I got to the airport. I got through security. I got patted down because I always get patted down going through security. I think it's just that I have muscles of steel or something that sets off the alarms. But I got patted down, and I was just leaving there, and I got a notification on my phone that says, your flight has been delayed. You're not going to make your connection. We've rescheduled you for this flight tomorrow, 24 hours from now. I'm like, that is not what I wanted to hear. And so I went up to an agent. I'm like, tell me more about what's going on. He says, well, we're under a weather delay here, so you're not going to make your connection in Charlotte. And I said, well, what if the Charlotte plane is delayed? I could still make it then, right? And he goes, well, maybe. I said, I'll take my chances. Send me to Charlotte. He says, all right, we can do that. So he got me a new boarding pass, got me back on the plane. And we sat there about an hour and a half, 2 hours in Sarasota. And we got to the point where I'm looking, I'm not going to make that flight unless that flight's delayed. And I'm watching, and that flight was delayed. I'm like, yes, this is great. As we're flying, I'm on my phone. It's airplane mode, don't get me wrong, but I've got the Wi-Fi in the airplane. And I'm watching, and that plane's delayed. I've got 30 minutes to make the flight. This is great. I looked at the gates. We're going to be right next to each other. This is perfect. Right? Walk off one plane, walk on to another one. We landed. I've got 30 minutes. We taxi up, and we stop. And we sit there, and we wait, and we wait. And the captain finally comes on and says, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry. He goes, because of our delay, they don't have a gate for us, so we can't get off the plane. And I'm watching, and he goes, finally fires up the engines. We pull up to a gate, and I've got 10 minutes. I'm like, this is going to be great. And everybody stands up, and nobody moves. And after about 10 minutes, the captain comes on again and goes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry. He goes, we can't seem to find a jet bridge operator. And as I sat there, I watched my plane back up and leave. And so I got to spend some time in Charlotte. I went and visited Ben. I called him about midnight and said, hey, Ben, can I come spend the night, crash on your couch? And he's like, sure, Dad. So he came and picked me up a little after midnight, went to his house, spent the night with him. Next evening, he took me back to the airport for my new flight that they'd scheduled me on. Got to the airport, got through security, got patted down like always, got out to the gate, was supposed to leave, I think, at 10 o'clock and get in here about midnight. And the flight was delayed. And it got to be 10:30, and it got to be 11, and they kept delaying it. Another half hour, another half hour. I'm like, this is not what I wanted to do. I want to go home. Finally, there were thunderstorms in the area, so the whole airport was pretty much shut down. So there were people everywhere. Finally, about 1:30, I see the pilot walk off the plane. Like, that's not a good sign, right? And the person there at the boarding area got on and announced, says, ladies and gentlemen, he goes, I'm tired of seeing you here. He goes, I'm sure you're all nice people, but I'm tired of seeing you. I'm trying to get you out of here. But the pilot has run out of hours and can't make this flight. He said, we're trying to find a new captain. He says, everyone else on the crew is fine. We just need a captain. I'm like, okay. About 2 o'clock, my phone beeps and it says, your flight has now been canceled. You're scheduled on the flight tomorrow at 10 p.m. So this is 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm not in the greatest of moods. Either is anybody else. There's about 1,000 people because there are about 5 planes in this at the very end of the terminal, and all of us were there in the same boat. They canceled all 5 flights at the same time. So I'm like, well, 2 o'clock in the morning, what am I going to do? I'll try to find a hotel. All the hotels, you called them up. And first of all, you can't make a reservation online at 2 in the morning for that same night. They're trying to schedule you for that night. So I'm trying to call, and they just pick up the phone and didn't even say anything other than, we're fully booked. So I'm like, okay, I guess I'm spending the night in the airport. I found a little place to lie down for a half hour on the cold tile floor. Sat up, looked around, I see a line starting to form at customer service. I'm like, I should go get in line. Went and got in line, spent the next 5 hours waiting in line till I finally got to the front, and an agent tried every combination she could think of and finally said, come with me. I'm like, okay. She got up from her desk, she looked at the person beside her and said, we're going to C4. I'm like, I'm going to C4. Walked over to C4, said something to the guy there. He looked at her like, I can't believe you're saying this. And she says, you're on this flight to Washington, D.C. You should be able to get home from there. And so I got home. My wife picked me up, and that has been kind of how my week has gone. And I want to ask myself, what else could go wrong? And I was doing that as we were flying into Reagan Airport in D.C., and I see that we're crossing the Potomac River, and I'm like, a lot of things could go wrong, right? I hope there's no helicopter here. But sometimes things just don't seem to go our way, and we wonder, what could go wrong? And that is kind of like, if I can turn this on, there we go. Kind of like Job, went too far, sorry about that. Like Job, wondering what could go wrong. It was about 6 weeks ago that Dawn and I were talking about the different sermons coming up, and Dawn told me that this week was on Job chapter 2. And I don't know if I winced visibly, but I winced inside, because Job is not what I would say is my favorite book. It's difficult. Job is tough, right? I mean, there's a bunch of stuff in there that I don't understand theologically. When we talk about Job being blameless, God calls Job blameless. How can Job really be blameless? And then you have this conversation between Satan and God. How can they be in the same place with God's utmost holiness and Satan? How can they be in the same place and having this conversation? And Job offering sacrifices for his children in case they have done something wrong. And Job's the one doing these, and then Job's children all being killed, and all this. It's like, oh man. But then Job has some other things in it too, right? Job has a conversation with God. God talks to Job, and I think, I might be wrong here, I think it is the longest quotation of God in the scriptures. It's the longest quotation of God the Father in the scriptures. Is God talking to Job? I mean, Job, God comes along and he tells Adam, eat of any tree except for that one. And that's pretty much what we know, right? God tells Noah, build an ark. Gave him a few instructions. God told Abraham, go to a land that I'll show you. And that's kind of the extent of it. Job, 4 chapters, chapter 38, 39, 40, 41, is God's speaking, right? That's really cool. And guess what? We're not talking about any of that today, because there's just so much. We're going to start in Job chapter 1. We're going to look at some stuff from 1 and 2. In Job chapter 1, we find out that Job was blameless and upright, fearing God and avoiding evil. It's like, who does not want to be described that way, right? I would love it if someone was talking about me and they would say, oh, Curt, yeah, he's blameless, he's upright, he's God-fearing. That would be such a cool thing, right? That was Job. And Job, we find out in chapter 1, he's got 10 children, and he is extremely wealthy. See, in the day, you didn't have your money in the bank. You didn't have a bunch of gold. You had livestock. And Job, he had livestock, right? He had thousands of sheep and thousands of camels, 1,000 oxen, thousands of donkeys. And then it says he had many servants. I don't know if many is more than thousands or if it's less than thousands, but Job he had wealth. And he loved his children, right? Like I said, he had continually would offer sacrifices, burnt offerings on their behalf in case they had sinned. He loved them and wanted to make sure that they were right. And so with that setting, then we get to verse 6. And it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down it. And like I said, I don't understand theology of how Satan and God can be there together. And I'm not going into that because they were. We know that. And then we find out that God is he's kind of bragging on Job. Because continuing in verse 8, it says, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hands. Only do not stretch out your hand against him. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. See, God's bragging on, God is saying that Job is blameless, not just someone else. This is God's word himself. And Satan comes back and says, well, why wouldn't he honor you? Right? Why wouldn't he? You've blessed him. You've done everything for him. You put this hedge around him that I can't bother him. He gets it all. Of course he's going to. But Satan says, take it away and see what happens. See, Satan is telling God that he thinks there is a link between our blessing and our godliness, or at least between Job's blessing and Job's godliness. Satan is saying, Job is faithful only because you've blessed him. Right? Quit blessing him and see what happens. And it's kind of natural. As humans, right? We have the saying, you scratch the back that scratches yours. Right? That's what Satan is saying. Well, yeah, he's being faithful to you because you've done everything for him. Why wouldn't he? Take it away, though, Satan says, and see what happens. And so God says, all right, do what you want. Take it away. Just don't touch Job. And note here that evil and suffering have limits, and those limits are set by God. We may not understand it. Job didn't understand it. Satan has limits. Evil has limits, and those limits are set by God. God said, you can mess with his possessions, but you can't touch him. Right? God set the limit, so let's not forget that. But that limit, man, that seems like it was awfully close to Job. He lost it all, right? He lost his wealth, those thousands of sheep and donkeys and oxen, his servants, his kids. He lost it all. You know, some of us here, some of you have lost things, right? You've had a business deal gone bad. You've had crop failures. You had a market crash. You've had an uninsured loss. And you wonder, how am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to survive this? What am I going to do? And that was Job, right? He'd lost everything. Some of you have lost children. I can't imagine. I can't imagine what you've been through. The last 2 times I've visited my parents, I've walked out the door and it hits me. I might not ever see them again. Right? But they're 93. They're at the stage of life where you don't expect them to live much longer. You know they're not going to. God's numbered our days. Right? And they're still alive. I can call them. I'll call them this afternoon. But Job, he lost it all. He lost his wealth. He lost his children. They were just gone like that. And so we see in Job, we see 2 things. One, Job was a righteous man. And 2, he's suffering undeservedly at God's hand, or he's at least suffering with God's permission. Right? This entire book is built on those 2 things. That Job is righteous, but Job is suffering something he doesn't deserve. And we look at this and we think, We think, that's not right. What kind of a God would allow this? What kind of a God would allow a righteous person to suffer? Not my God, we want to say, right? My God is good. My God is love. Right? He loves us too much to let that happen to us. Job looked at it a little bit differently. Job looked at it and he's trying to reconcile his experience of suffering with his knowledge of innocence. He's like, how does this work? And he's struggling with, I'm innocent, but I'm suffering. And at one point, he asked his wife, he said, don't we need to accept the good with the bad? He goes, God is still in control. He says, if God gives us good things and he gives us bad, don't we need to accept them both? And so what did he do when all of this bad happened? Skip to verse 20. It says, then Job rose and tore his robe and shaved his head. And he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all that Job did, he did not sin or charge God with wrong. He fell to the ground and worshipped. Is that our nature when our retirement account dries up? Is that our nature when a loved one is sick or dying? Is that our response when our flight is canceled again? Job worshipped. Despite all of this, Job worshipped. And then we get to chapter 2 and we see a repeat of all of this again. It goes all over. Skip ahead to Job chapter 2, verse 3. It says, and that Satan was again there in the presence of the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? And there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. God's saying, look at this man, despite everything that you've done, right? You said that he would turn. Despite everything you've done, nothing has changed. He is still upright. He is still blameless. He's done nothing wrong. Continuing in verse 4, then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. All that a man has, he'll give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he's in your hand. Only spare his life. And so again, God limits what Satan could do. He shifted the line. He gave Satan more room to prove his point. First time, Satan could do whatever he wanted to Job's things, but not touch Job. This time, he can mess with Job. He just can't take his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? This guy, he's covered with sores. Bottom of his feet, so it hurts to walk. Right? On his backside, so it hurts to sit down or lie down. His whole body is consumed with big, pussy boils. Right? Everything hurts. We don't know exactly when Job was written. We think it was probably one of the first accounts in the Bible. But when people in the Old Testament, when they had open sores, they were not allowed to be part of the camp. Right? They were sent out of the camp. And we know a lot of these things were in practice before we get the Mosaic law. And so imagine Job. He's in the dump. He's by himself. No one else will be around him. He's taking a piece of a broken pot and he's scratching on his arms. He's scratching off these open sores. He's scratching off the scabs because they hurt. The pus, the blood, he's scratching it. And he's there and he's questioning, how can he still trust God? And when someone asked him this, then he says, we need to trust God even in the bad, right? He says, shall we receive the good from God? Shall we not receive the evil also, right? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And we don't like this, right? We say we want God to reward us for good. Punishment should be for the bad. A good person shouldn't have to go through this. We want to be blessed for our faithfulness. And when we're not, then we cry out and we say, God, I'm being faithful. God, why is this happening to me? Because we want following Jesus to be easy. And it's not. Right? I don't know about you. I've been thinking about this. I can't think of one person in the scripture who was a follower of God who had it easy. Can you think of anyone who was a follower of God who had it easy? I mean, David was hunted like a deer, right? He was tracked. They were out to get him. They were trying to find his footsteps, looking for him, knowing that if they could find him, they would kill him. Joseph spent years in prison on false charges. Right? Abraham was told to sacrifice his son and move away from everything he knew to a land that he didn't even know. And Elijah's out in the wilderness for 3 years being fed by the birds. And we read over that and we think, well, he was fed every day, right? Have you seen what the birds are eating? I mean, seriously, the roadkill along the side of the road. What meat do you think they were bringing him on a daily basis? You think every day they flew into the market and stole a nice steak off some vendor's stand? Probably not, because the vendor probably didn't have them sitting out there. More than likely, the meat that he was getting every day was something that these ravens were picking up from something that had died. And when it came, it wasn't in a nice little saran wrap thing. It was a piece of meat, and he had to figure out how to cook it. The disciples were all killed or imprisoned. See, following God is not the bed of roses that we want it to be. It wasn't for Job, but through all of this, he never wavered. Right? He didn't understand, but he didn't waver. Because he didn't worship God for what God had done for him. He worshiped God because of who God was. Right? Not because of what God had done for him, but because of who God is. Because he is God. And that was all the reason that Job needed to worship. Job, he had about the worst things possible happen to him, right? He'd lost his wealth, he'd lost his family, he'd lost his health. Like I said, many of the people in the scriptures, we have accounts of people losing things. Job's not the only one. So I was thinking about this, and years ago, I was taking a shower, and 2 names came to me. It was Job and Jonah, and I'm like, Job and Jonah, what in the world? And it was as clear as day, and that's all it was Job and Jonah. And so I started to think about these 2 guys. And they both had really bad things happen to them, right? I mean, we've just been talking about Job, but think about Jonah. Right? You know this. I'm assuming everybody here knows the story. Jonah the fish, right? Jonah was disobedient. He was supposed to go to Nineveh. He decided he was going to run away, go to Tarshish. So he boards on the boat. God sends a storm. They throw him overboard, and the giant fish eats him. Right? And we think that God provided, and God did, but think about those 3 days for a little bit. I mean, he's inside this fish, gasping for air. I don't think it's like the kids' storybooks, right? Where Jonah's there on his knees and the water's, maybe up to his thighs, and he's praying and there's some light in there. It was pitch black. Pitch black inside this fish. He is surrounded by gunk, right? Stomach acid, half digested fish. He's fighting for every breath. His ears are popping from the pressure as the fish goes down. Kind of like when you fly, but ramped way up when your ears start to hurt. And there he is, swimming in the stomach acid, right? I mean, not to get too graphic, but let me get a little bit graphic. Imagine that you are in the tank of a truck that holds liquid. And that tank is full of fish vomit to 2 inches from the top. And you're trying to breathe. And you're trying to get your mouth or your nose up into that little air pocket of that really smelly stuff. And then the truck goes around the corner as you're taking a breath. And all of that liquid shifts, and what you thought was going to be a breath of bad air turned out to be a glug of something you really don't want in your mouth. and you can't see. And this goes on for 3 days, right? I mean, this guy, this was bad. And when he finally got vomited out on the beach, it says, imagine him staggering up the beach. His skin is bleached. It probably has open sores on it as his body had started to get digested. He's staggering up the beach covered in seaweed and fish parts. And I feel sorry for the guys that found him, right? They probably smelled him coming before they saw him. It's like, what is that smell? And then they see this white thing, all bleached out, staggering towards them, right? Jonah had it bad too, but the reason was different. Because unlike Job, Jonah went through this because of his disobedience. And through the years, when things haven't been going well for me, I ask myself, am I Job or am I Jonah? Am I Job or am I Jonah? Are the bad things in my life because I have ticked off Satan and he's trying to make my life miserable, seeing if I will be unfaithful? Or is the bad in my life because I'm being disobedient and God is trying to get my attention? So Thursday night, I was tired. I was working on the sermon. I'd gotten home on Tuesday. Wednesday, I had to make a quick trip up to Michigan, 600 miles round trip to help out Larissa. Gone to work on Wednesday. Wednesday night or Thursday night, I'm working on the sermon. I'm tired. I'm sure I was grouchy. And my wife says, she goes, you just need to go to bed and work on this tomorrow. And I'm like, no, I've got to stay up and get something done. So I worked until I couldn't stay awake anymore. And I went to take a shower before I crawled into bed. And I stepped into the shower and a thought came to me and it was, or John. And I just stood there and I'm like, or John what? Or John what? And then I thought, am I Job? Am I Jonah? Or am I John? And in my state of half awakeness, I was there and I thought, well, John had some bad stuff in his life too. And in my half sleep, I thought, John was shipwrecked 3 times and he spent a day and a night at sea and he ended up on Malta with a snake bite. And I was tired and I went and I got a piece of paper and I wrote, or John, and I set it on my computer and I went to bed. And some of you are cringing right now. I hope all of you are cringing because I got up in the morning and I thought, that wasn't John. That was Paul. All that stuff happened to Paul. So what's with John? Right? What's with John? And I started looking at John. John was exiled to the island of Patmos. And so I started looking at the island. It's a small, rugged, rocky island. It was a penal colony by the Romans. They would send their prisoners there. And there were very few people that went there that came back. Patmos was the island where they sent you to die. Right? It was life imprisonment pretty much for most of them there. And that's where John was sent. But while he was there in that harsh environment, God used him. God gave him a revelation. God gave him dreams that we have recorded in the book of Revelation. And then I began to wonder, all those hours in the Charlotte airport, what were they for? See, I'm not bashful about talking to people. That's all the time. So I'd strike up conversations with people. It's like, hey, we're stuck in line for the next 4 or 5 hours. I can talk to you guys. And so I talked to a guy from the University of Virginia who was trying to get back to work. He was a pipe fitter there. I had a conversation with a couple from I'm not sure where they were from, actually. They were returning home from a vacation in Mexico, trying to get home. I spent an hour sitting beside a traveling nurse that was trying to get back to the University of Iowa so she could go to work. I spent probably another hour talking with an off-duty flight attendant who was trying to get to Washington, D.C. so that she could go to work. I walked around the airports. I talked to people. I talked to people in lines. I talked to people in restaurants. Some airports have chapels. Did you know that? I've never been in an airport chapel before, but I went and found it to see if there was anyone there I could talk to. Right? When you have a thought of time at an airport, you can do some crazy things. Was the reason that God had me in that airport for so long was because he wanted me to talk to people? And if so, 1, why was I in such a hurry to leave? And 2, why didn't I do a better job of talking about my faith? So, as I try to land this thing this morning, so to speak, I have to ask you, when you are experiencing bad things in your life, are you Job or are you Jonah or are you John? Because if you're experiencing something as a result of sin, if you're Jonah, then you need to repent. You need to pray like Jonah did. You need to get right with God because he's trying to get your attention. But if the bad in your life is because God is proud of you and he's bragging on you to Satan, I don't want to say bring it on. I don't ever want to say bring it on. But man, stand firm. Stand firm. Right? If you frustrated Satan with your faithfulness, you're doing something right. You're pleasing to God. And if it's not one of those things, maybe the things that are happening in your life is because God is preparing to do a great work through you. Maybe he's revealing something to you. Maybe he has a job that he wants you to do that you can't do any other way, to be a blessing to other people. Maybe he's going to use you to further his kingdom like he did John. And not everything that happens to us is one of those three things. Sometimes what we say are bad things happen to us because we deserve them, right? We make bad choices. We do things and we have to reap what we sow. But I want to encourage you this morning to look at your life. Look at those frustrations. Look at the bad things that happen and ask yourself, am I like Job? Or am I like Jonah? Or am I like John? Because if you're going through things that have upset the devil, because God's trying to get your attention or whatever, how you respond to those questions is important. But above all, we need to worship God for what he has done in you. Because we worship God like Job, not because of what he has done for us, but because of who he is, the one and the only holy, holy, holy God.